Now, before we get into Deuteronomy, one thing that I love history. I think it's one of the ways that I deal with the challenges that, and things that don't make sense, and how it's so easy to kind of get caught into the negativity going around, in the world. Is I like to actually look at reality and where things have been, and how good things are now versus where they have been in the past, right? So before we get into Deuteronomy, I read this article. It's about kind of the founding of Mother's Day. It looks like the founding of Mother's Day, and I'm sure there's multiple ways, but it's actually by the daughter of a lady named Ann Jarvis. And her daughter, Anna, is the one who kind of started getting it. Ann Jarvis was very faithful at her Methodist church, taught Sunday school, was the reason she did what she did came from her faith. But she was born in 1832 in Virginia, married at the age of 18. Now, get this, had 13 children over the course of 17 years. Man, that's a long 17 years. Wow. Man. So, but and this is both, because it's kind of a mixture of emotions here. But so what's interesting is you look at 1832, the chances of her actually surviving 13 births is incredible. So at that point in the 19th century, early 1800s to the mid 1800s, between 500 to 1,000 moms died for every 100,000 live births. Okay, now that number has dropped to today, and this still includes the whole world, not just modern countries, has dropped to less than 200 per 100,000. But again, that includes even third world countries. The difference is staggering. But not only that, and the very sad part about this, and kind of what drew her to really emphasize family and working, is of the 13 children that she had, only 4 of her children lived to adulthood. One died from measles, typhoid, diphtheria, all kinds of just basic things. And if you look, in the beginning of 1800, it was the average mom would lose 3 children. 3 of her children would not see adulthood. By the 1850s, that had already dropped to 2 children. The average would see 2 children that would not reach adulthood. In 1900, that fell to 1 child would not see, but that was the average. Today, it is very rare, especially in that you don't see your children become adults. And I was just thinking about that, and part of the reason is that this lady Ann, she was a pioneer in encouraging sanitation, how to avoid disease, all of that. And she made that a mission, and all of that started changing. And we live in such a better time now, thanks to people like her, right? And we shouldn't forget that. We have it tough. It's tough. Life is always tough. But can you imagine if the average mom today lost 2 children, and didn't see 2 children? I don't know if our society could handle that. We are so blessed beyond what we even know. And I just thought that's important to remember, and to thank people like Anne, who used her heartbreak and started recognizing, okay, here's some things that we can do so that others don't have to endure this as well. Again, how God makes gardens from graves, right? He is always working for the good. All right. So as we continue into Deuteronomy, I have to admit, I've found myself really liking Deuteronomy, and I'm only made it to like the 4th chapter. And it was hard for me not to, there's just certain verses that you could wrap a whole sermon around. right? And that apply so much to today and what's going on in our society around us. Remember kind of some of the parameters, if you will, that I want us to be thinking about as we're going through Deuteronomy. One, we're thinking about a biblical worldview. So we're learning things about the character and the nature of God, and how that relates to us. We have to constantly be, as we're doing this, we need to apply it individually as well as corporately. So God, obviously, he cares about you as an individual. He wants you to come to a saving knowledge of him so that you are with him forever, right? He desires that. But he also desires good in society, right? That's why he called a nation. He called a nation to be an example to other nations, to be an example of what a good society should look like, right? So God cares about all of that, because guess what? You can be a strong Christian, be faithful, and doing everything that you're supposed to be obedient to God, reverent to God, living your life for God. And if you're living in 1960 Soviet Russia, your life is hell. So do we really think that God doesn't care about those societal structures? Does he want his children to endure the evils that can come when a society follows its own worldview rather than a biblical worldview? No, of course he cares, right? And so we're going to kind of be thinking about that. So we kind of weave in and out between our how this applies to us individually, and then also how this applies to us corporately, to our society. It's important to understand that. And honestly, I think whenever we really start seeing things through a biblical worldview, the world, even today, starts making more sense, right? Because it doesn't make rational sense at all, the world right now, at all. But when we see it through a biblical worldview, we can kind of start understanding, oh, that's what happens whenever you completely turn your back on God. That's what he means by that, right? So you may not like it, but you will be able to understand it a little bit more. So remember, Deuteronomy is written by Moses. This is basically his farewell address to the people. And so right now at the beginning, they are getting ready to cross over the Jordan River and to go and take the promised land. They had been there 40 years before, remember, ready to do the same exact thing. And the people decided not to do it, and they paid the price. So the price was wandering in the desert for 40 years. Literally a 11-day hike took them 40 years to make, right? Because they didn't trust God. So Moses is kind of rehashing that. He's telling the story again. And in telling the story, we can learn so much. So there's going to be two parts to the sermon today. They both play on each other. The first, we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 1. And again, this is Moses. He's talking about how they were at this point before. And then they sent out the spies. Remember, they sent out the spies, and then 10 of the spies come back and say, no, they're too big, and stuff like that. So that's kind of, he's at that point in the story. So Moses chapter 1, first just verse 21 says, see, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up, take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Right? That's extremely important. So God tells them that. Then they send out the spies and they make the decision not to go. So we're going to skip to verse 28. But you were unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord hates us. So he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear. They say, the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large, the walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there. Then I said to you, do not be terrified. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you, as a father carries his son all the way you went until you reached this place. In spite of this, you did not trust the Lord your God, who went ahead of you on your journey, in fire by night and in the cloud by day, to search out the places for you to camp and to show you the ways that you should go. When the Lord heard what you said, he was angry and solemnly swore, no one from this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to give your ancestors. All right, let's stop there. This is an uncomfortable truth about God. One, God calls us to do things that may bring some fear, that may bring some uncertainty. In fact, he knows that what he's calling us to do is not easy and that we can't do it on our own. He knows that, which is why he walks with us. Says that's why he is the one that fights the battles, right? And now this is a little different situation. You know, you have to think about the people, what they've seen. They've seen God do incredible stuff. Part the Red Sea, right? Give them manna from heaven. All of these things that they have experienced already. And they get to this place and God says, now it's time for you to go and do the hard stuff. Now, in the people's defense, did that mean that there wouldn't be suffering involved in them taking the land? No, there was going to be suffering. There's no indication that there was not going to be one warrior lost from the people of Israel. It was going to hurt. There was going to be challenges. It wasn't going to be just a cakewalk, but God was leading them and God was going to ensure victory. Right? But they started seeing things through their own eyes. And in their own eyes, they actually made probably the right decision. Here they are, a ragtag group of people who have been slaves for a long time, who are now going, and they're supposed to go conquer warrior tribes. No, they were like, no, we're not ready for this. We're not equipped for this. Where are our swords? Where are the chariots? Maybe we can swim down to the bottom of the Red Sea and get the ones that the Egyptians left, right? They're at this place, and all of a sudden they start seeing things through their own eyes. And they realize, man, these people are big. They have better armor than us. They're more equipped than us, right? They're ready. We can't do this. And so they forget in their mind. Isn't it amazing how quickly our human mind, we are a what have you done for me lately kind of people, even back then. And it's like, yeah, I know God parted the Red Sea, but that was like 4 weeks ago. Come on. You know, what has he done for me lately? Right? It's amazing how quickly we can forget. And the people and then they start, because they leaned, and this is the important part, because they started to focus on their own worldview and not a biblical worldview, they started making excuses. And your mind starts going, right? And they get to the point that they say, does this God, he hates us. He just brought us out from Egypt just to see us destroyed, right? Isn't that? So they're justifying their own fear. They're justifying why they are not trusting God, because it doesn't make sense to them. And they are focused on seeing things through their own lens. They are creating their own worldview. When you create a biblical worldview, guess what? You would still see the same challenges. They would see, man, those people are really tall. They're really big. They have a lot more swords than us. Their armor is much better than ours. We're probably going to suffer some setbacks. But God has called us. God is moving in this direction. And he is going to be with us just like he's been, you would remember, just like he was with us in Egypt, just like he sent Moses, just like he parted the Red Sea. You remember those things because that's a biblical worldview. And you say, okay, in my strength, I don't see how this can be done, but I know this is what God is calling me to do. And by the way, there wasn't question here. Right? Sometimes it's harder for us to know, what God is calling us to do. Here, there was no question. God was calling them to go back to the promised land. There was no question. Right? And so that biblical worldview is able to say, okay, man, I don't know how this is going to happen, but I know God has gotten us through this before. He's done amazing things. And so, you know what? I'm going to trust that he's going to do it again. And so let's go. But in their humanness, they didn't. That's important for us to understand. The uncomfortable part to me about this, even though it makes complete sense whenever you step back, is God became angry at that. See, we don't like to use those two words together, God and angry. Right? We in fact, many times we are nicer than God in our preaching and the way that we approach society. Many times I think we are nicer than God desires for us to be. God became angry. Now, it's a righteous anger. Right? And because of that anger, there became consequences to their inaction. There are consequences to their disobedience, that they did not listen to God. Right? And that is vital for us to understand, that God is a God who loves us, who desires what is best for us, which, by the way, the reason that he was calling them into the promised land, why was that? Because that was what was best for them. They were going to be blessed through that. They were going to become the nation that he desired for them to be, so that then they could be blessings to other nations. But yeah, it wasn't going to be easy. And so God says, no, this is what I'm calling you to do. And then when they refuse and when they become disobedient, it angered God. Did that mean that God abandoned them? No. But it did anger God. And then there were consequences that had to be paid. That is part of who God is. It's important to understand that, having a biblical worldview. There are consequences to individuals' actions, but guess what? There are consequences to societal actions as well. And, I have no doubt there were a lot of people that weren't part of the spies that were sitting there going, wait, God told us to go and do this. Don't y'all remember we walked across dry land on the Red Sea? Why don't we listen to him? But they were the minority. Guess what happened to them? They wandered for 40 years. And man, every day they were probably like, told you so. Right? I sure would be. But so you can be a godly person. You can desire to do what is best. But if the society around you goes in a different direction, unfortunately, you find yourself having to deal with wandering through the desert for 40 years. Oh, I don't want that to be true. But that is true, right? And then you continue to move on. So again, applying this to your own life, also to society. I wanted to include this because as I was reading, this is in chapter 1, verse 41. So now God tells them, all right, you're not going to go? Have fun wandering for 40 years. And not only that, he's like, the reason that I'm doing that is because I want to make sure all of you of fighting age are dead and gone. You're not going into the promised land, right? I'm not going to take you out just right away, but you're going to get sick of walking through the desert, and then that's where you're going to be buried, right? I mean, this is, right? And so the people, they realize, and it kind of, maybe we should have reconsidered. And so they try. Verse 41 says, then you replied, we have sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight, as the Lord our God commanded us. So every one of you put on his weapons, thinking it was easy to go up into the hill country. But the Lord said to me, tell them, do not go up and fight, because I will not be with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. So I told you, but you would not listen. You rebelled against the Lord's command and in your arrogance, you marched up into the hill country. The Amorites who lived in those hills came out against you. They chased you like a swarm of bees and bare down from Seir all the way to Hormah. Then you came back and wept before the Lord, but he paid no attention to your weeping and turned a deaf ear to you. Whew. All right. Now, this is pretty interesting to me, because what happens is the people, they hear the consequences. And guess what? They don't want to deal with the consequences. And so they're like, okay, this is really bad. So maybe if I just ask for forgiveness real quick. Oh, you know what? You're right, Lord. We have sinned. And you know what? We're going to listen to you now. We're going to go and we're going to fight the battle. And so you start getting the gear up and everything like that. And the Lord's like, no, you have to pay for the decisions that you already made. It's like, I know, Lord, but we asked for forgiveness and now we're ready to go. So let's go. And God says, it's not the right time. And so they go, and guess what? They get defeated. And then it says they weep, and the Lord didn't hear their weeping. Now, it's important for us to understand what that's saying. Again, this doesn't mean that God didn't care. I believe God's heart broke. I believe he's up there going, God, why didn't you just listen to me in the first place? Right? But whenever it says he doesn't hear our weeping, sometimes we have to endure, not sometimes, all the time, we have to endure the consequences of our decisions. And it breaks God's heart, but you know what? He's not going to come in and remove the weeping from us. He's not going to just come in and remove the grief whenever we are paying the consequences of our rebellion. Now, again, it's important. This doesn't mean that God is abandoning. In fact, he's not. He's going to walk with them through the desert for 40 years. He's going to provide them food. He's going to provide them guidance and direction. Right? But they have to pay for that decision. And in our own life, it just kind of jumped out to me how we just live in a time where we don't want to pay for anything. Right? We don't want to have any consequences for anything, which is why, as a society, we don't like to talk about things as sin or talk about things as right or wrong. Because once you start doing that, then you have to start looking at, oh, well, maybe some of the bad stuff that's happening to me is my own fault. Oh, no, we don't want to do that. Right? And so we want to treat God kind of like we try with our parents, right? Your parents set a rule for you. You break that rule, but you know your parents love you. And you know if you bat your eyes just enough, and you know that if you go and take out the trash without your parents asking you to, they're going to go, oh, well, you know what? Maybe it's all right that they broke that rule. Right? And that's what we try to do with God. And it doesn't work. It does not work. And it's important for us to understand that. And as we look at this in an individual setting, we do need to be, one, taking very seriously the decisions that we make, and we need to choose to follow God. And then we also need to be self-aware enough. Remember, we talked a lot about wisdom last week. Part of wisdom is recognizing, now wait, is what I'm going through now, is it because I haven't been obedient to God? Is it because I haven't been faithful? And that hurts, and that takes some self-awareness. But it is vital that we do that we understand, okay, is this a result of my disobedience? And if it is, then we lean on God to help us navigate through the consequences, right? Just like the people, okay, here's the reality. We're going to have to wander for 40 years. All right, cry about that for a while, because it's worth crying about. But then you have to figure out how you're going to make it for the next 40 years. And the way that you should do that is you should say, okay, God, I'm learning, and now please be with me as I deal with these consequences. And guess what? God will. He will walk with you through the 40 years of the desert. Don't try to play God and pretend that you're repentant and then just go say, okay, well, now I'll do it right. All good? Everything, we're even now? Right? Don't treat God that way. It doesn't work. So I think that's vital to understand that God is a God where there are consequences. He calls us to obedience when we don't on an individual level. And yes, as a society, there will be consequences. Now, I want to skip ahead. We're going to be in chapter 4 because I think this is important. So the biblical worldview is that God is a God who calls us to follow him, and he will fight the battles for us and with us if we are following him. But if not, then that leads to consequences. So then in chapter 4, you have Moses has talked now about how the people wandered for 40 years, and now they're kind of back at the place, ready to cross into the Jordan again. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 4. Now, Israel, hear the decrees and the laws I'm about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you. You saw with your own eyes what the Lord did at Baal Peor. The Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal Peor. But all of you who held fast to the Lord your God are still alive today. Real quickly, Baal Peor was a pagan god of the Moabites, I believe, and the people were hanging out with them, and they started worshiping that god. It did not work out well for them. Right? And so God is reminding them, remember who you're supposed to worship. It's the one true God, not these pagan gods. And then it says, see, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all of these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near to us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today? Only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land, and may teach them to their children. All right, so there's so much here. But God is now giving the decrees and the laws, and Moses is reminding them of all these things that God is, and now Moses is going to go through all of those. And he's saying, you need to remember this. Why? So that you can be an example to the others, to the nations, right? That you are a nation that follows basic godly principles. Right? I'm giving you those principles. You follow them, and by doing that, you will actually be a light to the other nations, that they will see you and they will say, wow, that is a righteous nation. Why are they so righteous? Look at how close they are with their God. Right? And that leads to them starting to question, maybe our gods aren't really all that righteous. Right? God desired to work not only through the individual Israelites, but through the nation of Israel. And so he called them to follow his decrees. And he said, don't add to it, don't subtract to it from it. We tend to do both, right? In fact, This is kind of very simple, but society tends to subtract. The church, many times we tend to add, right? We start adding lots of different things. No, just follow what he says. Have a biblical worldview. That's what he's talking about here, is I want you as a society, as a nation, to have that, to be a light to the other nations. And then it says, but be careful, watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen. Right? And then it goes, teach your children, remind them about this stuff, because it's important for you to know who you are. And as you look at the history of the nation of Israel, they become, shockingly, a Bedouin nomadic tribe rises to be a worldly power as a nation. But then what happens? They start to forget. And they start to worship other gods. And their nation crumbles. God calls us to obedience, not just as individuals, right? But as societies. And I think of it, one of the things that sometimes the church makes the mistake of is the obedience, that we focus solely on that as individuals. And we kind of come at it from the place that, hey, you need to accept Christ or you're going to hell, right? And we kind of use that paradigm. And while there's obvious truth there, it doesn't always lead to obedience. I don't know. There's the wonderful movie Tombstone, filled with lots of theological thoughts, right? I'm your Huckleberry, all kinds of things. It's a great movie. If you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, there's the last scene, and basically whoever it is, the Kirk Russell or whoever is playing Wyatt Earp, he's taking everybody out, right? And he's doing it at vengeance. And he says, you tell them hell's coming, or I'm coming, and hell's coming with me. Right? And there's this scene that they're riding after the outlaws, and they're called the Cowboys, and they wear these red sashes. And they're riding. So hell's coming after this guy, and he's riding. And so he just takes his sash and he just throws it off. It's like, leave me alone, please. I don't want hell to come. Right? We have to be careful that that's not how we share the gospel, right? Just trying to get people to throw the sash, throw in the towel. Okay, I believe, just leave me alone. No, because God actually wants us to be obedient, to actually live out and change the way that we live, right? And that takes a lot more than just throwing in the red flag, right? We actually have to be obedient. And that's what God has called us to as individuals. But guess what? He called the nation of Israel to do that too. And when they failed, when they forgot, they became scattered throughout the world. The nation eventually dissolved. And I just want to quickly try to apply this to what's going on in our nation and our society. We are not the new Israel. But whether you like it or not, and I know a lot of people don't like it, in the founding of our country, the bedrock of it, there was a desire to follow biblical principles. That was there. There is no doubt. Now, there were many who came from Holland over and ended up being the first pilgrims. They saw this. They wanted to be a city on a hill. They wanted to be a light to the other nations, just like God was calling Israel. They wanted to mimic that. They were reading this stuff, and they were like, you know what? Let's do that too. Because look at what it did for Israel until they fell away. Why don't we do that? Right? That is part of who we are. And now as a nation, we have not taught our children that. We have not remembered that. And that's why we're seeing some of this stuff. Now, people will say, no, that's not really true. We've never been a Christian nation. Okay, That all of that is garbage. It is all lies. Have we ever been perfect? No, we have not. But that was incorporated into the way that we were founded and the way that we were set up to function. So you start taking that out, look at what it leads to. It leads to societal chaos. I just want, again, to prove to you that there's at least some basis for me saying this. Just a few quick quotes from founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin: freedom is not a gift bestowed upon us by other men, but a right that belongs to us by the laws of God and nature. Right? When they're talking about God, they are talking about the God of the Old Testament. Not all of them were Christians as we are Christians today, but they were talking about the one God that, again, that started to spoke to the people of Israel, that worked through Jesus Christ, that changed all of Western civilization. That's the God that they were talking about, right? And they recognized that it is Him that true freedom comes. And so we're going to acknowledge that. Every other society said, we're going to let the government be the one responsible for freedom. Well, that doesn't go so well. They said, no, it's God. Freedom comes from God. And so the government is designed to make sure that we are able to have that freedom that is a God-given right. Thomas Jefferson, who many would say is the least Christian of the founding fathers. He's gotten a lot of heat. But listen, he said, God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed the conviction that these liberties are a gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and His justice cannot sleep forever. This is someone who kind of has a biblical worldview. He understands that there are consequences for going against God. Right? In George Washington's farewell address, he said this: of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, so that which leads to a prosperous country, right? Religion and morality are indispensable supports. And let us with caution indulge the supposition or the idea that morality can be maintained without religion. When he's talking about religion, he is talking about the Christian faith, but he's for sure talking about a biblical foundational understanding. That's why the Ten Commandments were key to the founding of our whole justice system. He says, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail to the exclusion of religious principle, right? Which means you can't do it on your own. You can't just have a national morality that's not based on something. And that is true. Our morality will be based on something. It's either going to be based on our own understanding of stuff, which is pagan, and which is ultimately influenced by the one who desires to see us destroyed. Or it's based on a biblical worldview. That is what George Washington is saying. He says, in that last quote, it is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. They recognized how important it was to listen to these laws and decrees, and that as a society, as a country, that we adopt those and we strive to live up to them. Right? That was their worldview. That's what they were trying to do. One of the reasons that we're going through what we're going through today is because we thought in all of our wisdom, or maybe that word that was used back in chapter 1, in all of our arrogance, that we could do this on our own, that we could create our own morality. It doesn't work that way. So we are, I believe, experiencing some kind of wandering in the wilderness right now. And I like to think that there's many in here that are like, yeah, but I didn't want to be here. I was willing to go to the promised land. Well, you know what? You're in the wilderness. You're in a society that, unfortunately, many have decided to go their own way and think that they have a better way and rejected a biblical worldview. The answer to that is for us to double down on our trust in the one who fights our battles for us. That as individuals, we dedicate ourselves to being faithful to God and living for Him. And we do our best to influence society by living out these righteous decrees so that as things crumble, they will see and they'll say, you know what, maybe that's a good way to do it. Maybe we need to go back to that. But prepare yourself, because we are in the wilderness. That is where our society has sadly chosen to go. But know that God still walks with you. You do not have to fear. Do not be discouraged, just as God told the people, because He will walk with us every step of the way. Let's go to Him in